September 1st, 1939, Liverpool Street Station, London. The platform smelled of coal smoke and unwashed wool as Mrs. Dorothy Henshaw pinned a brown cardboard tag to her 7-year-old daughter's coat, the kind of tag normally reserved for luggage. Within 72 hours, 1.5 million children, mothers, and teachers would vanish from Britain's cities in the largest peacetime movement of civilians in history. Dorothy's hands trembled as she wrote Mary's name, age, and home address in careful block letters. Around her, hundreds of other mothers performed the same ritual, their children clutching gas masks in cardboard boxes and small cloth bags containing a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and, if they were lucky, a favorite toy. The station echoed with the sound of sniffling children and the mechanical click-clack of destination boards flipping through station names: Cambridge, Oxford, Wales, Devon. Anywhere that wasn't London. Operation Pied Piper had begun before the first German bomber crossed British airspace, before France fell, before anyone truly understood what war would mean. But someone in Whitehall understood geography and payload calculations. They knew that London, Birmingham, Manchester, the industrial hearts pumping Britain's war effort, would become targets. So the children had to go. The train doors slammed with metallic finality. Mary pressed her palm against the window glass, her breath fogging the pain. Dorothy stood on the platform, watching her daughter's face shrink into the distance, becoming one pale oval among hundreds receding into the morning haze. She would not see Mary again for 8 months. When they reunited, her daughter would speak with a Devonshire accent and flinch at the sound of motor cars backfiring. This was how the war came home, not with sirens or bombs at first, but with empty bedrooms and the peculiar silence of houses suddenly missing their children. Before you continue, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you're finding this story as gripping as I am, hit that like button and subscribe. There's so much more to uncover. By September 3rd, when Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's reedy voice crackled through wireless sets, announcing that Britain was at war with Germany, the transformation of ordinary life had already begun. That evening, at precisely sunset, the blackout descended. Every window, every street lamp, every shop front had to be darkened. Housewives nailed thick black fabric across windows. Shopkeepers painted their display windows with special blackout paint, leaving only narrow horizontal slits. Car headlights were fitted with metal hoods that reduced their beams to dim slashes pointing downward. The familiar glow that had defined urban nights since Edison, the warm spill of light from sitting rooms, the bright marquees of cinemas, the sodium orange of street lamps, simply ceased. London became a city of stumbling pedestrians and whispered curses. Traffic accidents increased by 600% in the first month. People walked into lampposts, fell off curbs, collided with each other in the dark. The government issued pamphlets recommending citizens carry a newspaper or wear white armbands to increase visibility. Some painted white stripes on their dogs. The darkness had a smell, damp stone and coal smoke, with none of the visual landmarks to distract from it. It had a texture, too. People learned to navigate by trailing their hands along brick walls and iron railings, developing a tactile map of their neighborhoods. Couples walking home from pubs moved slowly, arms linked, feet shuffling. The blackout created a strange nocturnal intimacy. Conversations happened in doorways between invisible speakers. The only pinpricks of light were cigarette tips, small orange dots that couldn't be hidden, bobbing like fireflies. Then, at precisely 11 minutes past 11 on the morning of September 7th, 1940, the Blitz began. The first wave came on a Saturday afternoon. 348 German bombers, escorted by fighters, crossed the channel in formation so large they appeared on radar screens as solid masses. The air raid sirens, high mechanical wails that would become the soundtrack of urban British life, began their ululating scream across London's East End. The docks at Rotherhithe and West Ham erupted in flames. By nightfall, 430 acres were burning. The smoke column rose 10,000 feet, visible from the French coast. For the next 57 consecutive nights, the bombers returned. Margaret Collins, a clerk at Woolworths who kept a detailed diary throughout the war, wrote on September 10th, "Cannot describe the sound properly, like someone tearing enormous sheets of canvas, then the crump, crump, crump of explosions. Our Anderson shelter smells of damp earth and father's pipe tobacco. Mother brought down quilts, but they're already mildewed. We played cards by candlelight while the building shook. Baby cried the first 3 nights. Now she sleeps through it. I don't know if that's better or worse." The Anderson shelter, a curved shell of corrugated steel, named after Home Secretary John Anderson, had been issued free or subsidized to households earning less than £250 annually. Installation instructions came with the kit. Dig a pit 4 feet deep in your garden, bolt the steel panels together, heap the excavated earth over the top, plant grass or vegetables on the mound. 3 million were distributed by the outbreak of war. They were cold, cramped, and perpetually damp. Families of 5 or 6 squeezed onto wooden benches, wrapped in every blanket they owned, listening to the whistle and crash of bombs. The shelters had a distinctive smell: wet metal, disturbed soil, mildew, and the sharp tang of fear sweat that no amount of airing could eliminate. Children learned to judge the danger by their parents' faces, reading tension in jawlines and white knuckles. But the shelters kept people alive. Above ground, London transformed into a geography of absence and rubble. Entire streets could vanish overnight, leaving only a bomb crater and scattered bricks. The city developed a persistent film of soot on every surface: window panes, doorsteps, even the leaves of trees in parks. The smell never left: smoke, wet stone, and cordite, a chemical bite that clung to clothes and hair. Housewives swept powdered glass and plaster dust every morning, knowing it would return by evening. The war had moved from distant abstraction to immediate reality, and it would only intensify. What happened when even the shelters weren't enough? When people needed to go deeper, further underground, into spaces never designed for human habitation? That answer was already forming in the tunnels beneath London's streets. Bethnal Green Station, October 19, 1940, 10:30 in the evening. The escalators were stationary, their grooved metal steps forming makeshift beds for 230 families who had claimed their spots with chalk marks and blanket bundles. When the bombs fell above, thousands fled to the only place that felt truly safe. 8 stories down into the earth, the London Underground had never been designed as a shelter. Transport officials initially resisted, fearing panic would jam platforms and disrupt troop movements. But on September 7th, as the East End burned, residents of Stepney forced open the locked gates of Liverpool Street Station and simply claimed the tunnels. Within days, the government surrendered to reality. By October, over 170,000 Londoners were sleeping in the tube every night. The deep-level stations had their own ecosystem. The smell hit you first: unwashed bodies, urine from overflowing chemical toilets, damp concrete, and the metallic tang of the rails. Then the sounds: children crying, someone's wireless playing dance music, the periodic rumble of trains still running service until 10:30, and underneath it all, the drip, drip, drip of groundwater seeping through tunnel walls. The air was thick, warm from packed bodies, and tasted of coal dust. Families arrived before dusk to claim their spots. Mrs. Ethel Jenkins, a laundress from Shoreditch, marked her family's territory on the platform with a piece of chalk, a rectangle barely large enough for 2 adults and 3 children to lie down. She brought blankets, a thermos of tea, and a tin of condensed milk for the baby. Her diary entry from November 2nd read, "Slept between the yellow line and the wall again. Sarah, age 4, asked why the pigeons come down here too, told her they're sheltering same as us. Didn't mention the rats. Tom says he saw one big as a cat. The trains stop at 10:30, and then we can spread out a bit on the tracks. Woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of someone playing a harmonica. We'll meet again." Everyone joined in singing. Strange what feels normal now. The platforms developed a social order. Families who arrived earliest claimed spots away from the lavatories. Regular residents knew which sections had the worst drafts, where puddles formed, which corners the rats favored. The government eventually installed bunk beds, pipe frames with canvas stretched between, but there were never enough. Pregnant women and the elderly got bunks. Everyone else made do with the concrete. Medical officers worried about disease: typhoid, tuberculosis, scarlet fever. The crowding made infection inevitable. Yet something remarkable happened in those tunnels. Londoners organized themselves. Volunteer wardens patrolled, maintaining order. Women formed committees to manage the chemical toilets and organize children's activities. Someone always had a deck of cards. Someone else always knew a song. Adversity had created accidental community. Above ground, another transformation was beginning. This one slower, more grinding, and ultimately more total than the bombs. April 1st, 1940, the first ration books were issued. Sugar first, 8 ounces per person per week, then butter, 4 ounces, then bacon, then meat, then tea, then margarine, then cooking fats, then cheese. By 1942, almost everything that could be eaten, worn, or burned for warmth required coupons clipped from small paper booklets that became more valuable than currency. The ration books were buff-colored, roughly the size of a passport, filled with rows of tiny printed squares. Each square represented a week's allowance of specific items. Housewives studied them like sacred texts, planning meals days in advance. calculating whether to use next week's butter ration for a child's birthday cake or save it for Christmas pudding 3 months away. The clack, clack, clack of scissors cutting coupons became a household sound, as regular as the tick of the mantel clock. Meat rations were calculated by price, not weight, 1 shilling and twopence worth per person per week at the depth of shortages. That might mean 4 ounces of beef, or 6 ounces of mutton, or 8 ounces of liver if you were lucky. Butchers became objects of courtship. Women queued for hours, hoping the shop wouldn't run out before their turn. The phrase "under the counter" entered common usage, a whispered promise that a shopkeeper might have something extra for favorite customers. Helen Bradford, a schoolteacher in Coventry, wrote to her sister in Canada, "Waited 2 hours at Mitchell's for our week's meat. When my turn came, Mr. Mitchell apologized. Only sausages left, mostly bread and sawdust by the taste. But he winked and slipped me a small tin of corned beef from beneath the counter, said it was for my kindness to his boy last term. I nearly wept. Strange how a tin of Argentine beef can feel like treasure." The National Loaf appeared in July 1942. WWII's government-mandated wholemeal bread darker and denser than the white loaves people remembered. It smelled of bran and had a texture somewhere between bread and damp cardboard. Children complained. Adults learned to chew thoroughly. But it stretched farther than white flour, and it contained vitamins that would keep a nation on its feet. Within months, bakeries across Britain produced nothing else. Eggs became memories, real eggs anyway. The government introduced National Dried Egg, a yellow powder mixed with water that produced something approximating scrambled eggs with the texture of rubber and a faintly chemical aftertaste. 1 tin, the equivalent of 12 eggs, had to last a month. Housewives learned to make it palatable. Mix with milk powder, add herbs from the garden, serve with fried tomatoes if you had them. Children born after 1940 grew up thinking this was what eggs tasted like. Scarcity became the national curriculum. The Ministry of Food plastered Britain with posters. Make do and mend became the governing philosophy of civilian life. Pamphlets explained how to unpick old sweaters and re-knit the wool. Radio programs demonstrated how to convert curtains into skirts, how to resole shoes with tire rubber, how to darn stockings so the mend was barely visible. Women's magazines ran monthly columns on clothing surgery, how to remove the good fabric from worn garments and reconstruct them into something wearable. Mrs. Agnes Morrison, a Birmingham housewife, kept meticulous records of her wardrobe renovations. Remade George's old suit into a jacket for young Robert, used the trouser legs for patches on 3 other pairs. Seat of the trousers became pot holders, buttons removed and saved. Wool lining unpicked and added to my knitting basket, nothing wasted, would have felt virtuous before the war, now it's simply Wednesday. Clothing coupons were even more precious than food rations. Each person received 66 coupons annually, barely enough for basic needs. A man's suit cost 26 coupons. A dress required 11. A pair of shoes needed 5. Stockings, the rayon kind that replaced silk and nylon, cost 2 coupons but laddered easily. Women learned to draw stocking seams up the backs of their bare legs with eyebrow pencil, hoping the illusion would pass at a distance. The war was fought not just in the skies, but in sitting rooms, at kitchen tables, in the careful calculus of making do. Every patched coat was a small victory. Every vegetable grown in a back garden was ammunition against U-boats strangling Britain's supply lines. Across Britain, 1 million lawns and flower beds were being dug up, transformed into rows of cabbages and potatoes. But something else was being dug up too, something harder to replant when the war ended. The very structure of family life, the daily rhythms that had defined British domesticity, was being excavated and rebuilt. What happened when the women left home to build the machines of war? March 23, 1942, Royal Ordnance Factory, Chorley, Lancashire. The night shift began at 6 o'clock, and by 7, the air inside tasted of cordite, machine oil, and the sharp metallic tang of brass casings rolling off production lines at 1,200 rounds per hour. Dorothy Chen, formerly Dorothy Mitchell, housewife, mother of 2, operated lathe number 47, her hands steady despite the vibration that rattled her teeth. She had never touched a machine tool before December. Now she made artillery shells that would kill men she would never see, in places she couldn't pronounce. The transformation had happened with bureaucratic speed. In December 1941, the National Service Act made all unmarried women aged 20 to 30 liable for war work. By mid-1942, the net widened. Married women without children under 14, women up to age 40, then 45. Britain mobilized its female population. With the same systematic efficiency, it mobilized its men. The difference was that women went to the factories while still running their households, raising their children, and managing the impossible mathematics of ration books. Dorothy's shift ended at 2 in the morning. She cycled home through the blackout, legs aching, hair still smelling of machine grease despite the scarf she wore. Her mother-in-law watched the children during the night shift, sleeping in Dorothy's sitting room on a camp bed. At 2:30, Dorothy would slip into her own bed beside her sleeping daughter. Her son had been evacuated to Wales, and sleep until 8. Then she would rise, prepare breakfast from whatever the rations allowed, queue at the butcher's, mend clothes, tend the vegetable garden her husband had dug before he shipped out to North Africa, and begin the cycle again. Her diary entry from April 9th, fingers so sore can barely hold the pen. The lathe vibrates for 8 hours, and my hands forget how to be still. Made quota today. Supervisor said my casings had the best tolerances on the line. Strange pride in that. Strange shame, too. I'm making things designed to explode inside human bodies. Try not to think about it. Try to think instead of David in his tank somewhere, needing ammunition that works. Better my shells than someone else's. Better anything than losing. Women poured into Britain's industrial workforce, 2 million of them by 1943. They operated cranes at shipyards, welded hulls at naval dockyards, assembled bomber fuselages at aircraft plants, and mixed high explosives in munitions factories where a single spark could vaporize an entire building. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and paid roughly half what men earned for identical labor. They did it anyway. The factories ran 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. The sound never stopped. The pneumatic hammer of riveters, the screaming whine of metal lathes, the rhythmic thump of hydraulic presses stamping out shell casings. Women learned to lip-read over the noise. They learned to sleep in factory canteens during 15-minute breaks, heads on folded arms. They learned that steel splinters could pierce work gloves and that cordite stained your skin yellow and took weeks to fade. If this story is hitting differently than what you learned in school, share this video with someone who needs to see it. These voices deserve to be heard. But the factories were only half the story. In fields across Britain, another army of women fought a quieter war against starvation. The Women's Land Army recruited over 80,000 women, shopgirls, clerks, hairdressers, students, and sent them to farms where male laborers had vanished into uniform. They were issued breeches, boots, and thick wool jumpers the color of dried mud. They slept in hostels and converted barns. They worked from dawn until dark, planting potatoes, harvesting wheat, mucking out stables, and learning that farming was nothing like the pastoral paintings suggested. Land girl Margaret Pike, a former librarian from Bristol, wrote home in June 1942, "My hands have forgotten what books feel like. They know instead the texture of hay bales, prickly, heavier than they look. The slick smoothness of a cow's flank at milking time, the grit of soil worked deep into every fingerprint. I smell of manure and sweat and earth. Mother would faint. But yesterday I drove a tractor, an actual tractor, and plowed 8 acres before lunch. There's satisfaction in that, strange as it sounds." The work was backbreaking. Sugar beet harvesting meant stooping for hours, pulling roots from cold mud, hands going numb despite gloves. Potato picking left land girls crawling into bed with muscles they hadn't known existed, screaming in protest. During harvest season, the workdays stretched to 14-16 hours. They slept in makeshift dormitories, converted chicken coops and stone cottages with no running water, and woke before sunrise to start again. Yet the Women's Land Army produced 90,000 tons of flax, 70% of the national potato crop, and kept Britain fed when U-boats were sinking supply convoys faster than they could be replaced. These women, who had never seen a farm before the war, became the agricultural backbone of a nation. Across the Atlantic, America's transformation followed a parallel track, but on a characteristically larger scale. The Office of Price Administration began rationing in 1942, sugar first, then coffee, then meat, then gasoline. American families received ration books identical in principle to Britain's, though the quantities were more generous. Still, the psychological shock was profound. Americans had never experienced systematic consumer restriction. The idea that you couldn't simply buy what you wanted when you wanted it clashed with fundamental national identity. Gasoline rationing hit hardest. Each car received a windshield sticker, A, B, or C, determining weekly allowance. A stickers for non-essential civilian use meant 3 gallons per week, barely enough for commuting. The open road, that symbol of American freedom, suddenly had a locked gate. But Americans adapted with characteristic energy. 20 million victory gardens sprouted in backyards, schoolyards, and vacant lots. By 1944, these gardens produced 40% of America's vegetables. Families who had never grown anything more ambitious than geraniums suddenly cultivated tomatoes, beans, squash, and lettuce. The smell of compost and turned earth became part of suburban life. Children learned to can vegetables, to preserve harvests in mason jars that lined basement shelves like ammunition stores. Scrap drives became communal ritual, almost carnival. Children combed neighborhoods for scrap metal, rubber, and paper. Church groups organized competitions. Which congregation could collect the most aluminum? Housewives donated pots and pans. Families drilled nails out of old furniture to contribute metal for munitions. In one Georgia town, residents dismantled the iron fence around the courthouse square piece by piece and sent it to the war. The drives created a sense of participation, of meaningful contribution, but they also revealed a darker arithmetic. For Japanese American families, participation meant nothing. February 19, 1942. Executive Order 9066. 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, two-thirds of them American citizens, were given weeks to abandon their homes, businesses, and possessions. They were sent to internment camps in remote deserts and mountains, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Families lost everything they had built over generations. Strawberry farms in California went to weeds. Shops in Seattle were sold for pennies or simply vandalized. Children missed years of school. The old died in camps, far from home. Mary Tsukamoto, a schoolteacher from Florin, California, wrote from the Fresno Assembly Center, "We sleep on cots in a horse stall. The smell won't leave. They gave us bags and told us to stuff them with straw for mattresses. My daughter asked why. I had no answer that made sense. We are Americans. We were Americans yesterday. Today we live behind barbed wire." The camps operated throughout the war. Some internees volunteered for military service anyway. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. They fought for a country that had imprisoned their families. Back in Britain, the war ground on. Families adapted to new rhythms. Dinner tables set with empty chairs, women's wages paying the rent. Children who barely remembered peacetime. The war had become normal, not comfortable, not easy, but familiar. The shortages, the queues, the sirens, the blackout, all of it routine. But routine had limits. Routine could be stretched and adapted and endured. What happened when routine shattered completely, when the bombs didn't just fall on cities but on the belief that anything would survive? May 8, 1945, VE Day, Trafalgar Square, London. The searchlights that had hunted German bombers for 5 years now swept across celebratory crowds, and for the first time since September 1939, London blazed with light. But in countless homes across Britain, the celebrations were muted by the empty chairs at the kitchen table. The war in Europe had ended. 6 years of blackouts, rationing, bombing, and separation were over. Street parties erupted spontaneously. Bunting made from old curtains, sandwiches made from hoarded rations, children dancing who had never known peacetime. Piccadilly Circus overflowed with servicemen and civilians, strangers kissing strangers, church bells ringing without signaling air raids for the first time since 1940. Yet for millions, the return to peace felt more like arrival at foreign country than homecoming. Eleanor Wright stood in her sitting room in Coventry, staring at furniture she no longer recognized. Her husband James had been released from the army in April. He'd returned gaunt, 40 pounds lighter, with a tremor in his left hand he claimed was nothing. He'd been gone 4 years. Their son Michael, evacuated at age 7, had returned at 11, speaking with a Yorkshire accent and flinching at loud noises. Their daughter hadn't been born when James left. She called him Sir and hid behind her mother's skirt. Eleanor's diary entry from May 10th read, "James sleeps on the floor. Says the bed is too soft. He starts at every car backfire, every slammed door. Michael asks why Daddy doesn't laugh. I have no answer. The man who left isn't the man who returned. Perhaps the woman he left isn't who's here now either. I've worked a lathe, managed a household on nothing, made every decision for 4 years. How do we fit back together? Do we even try? Or do we learn to be new people in the same house?" The returning servicemen found a Britain transformed. Women had run the factories, driven the ambulances, commanded anti-aircraft batteries, and broken German codes. They had proved capable of everything men claimed only men could do. Many had no intention of returning to pre-war domesticity. The factories wanted them to leave, to make room for returning soldiers, but thousands resisted. They had tasted independence, earned wages, made things that mattered. Surrendering that felt like another kind of defeat. Yet the government was clear. By 1946, most women had been systematically pushed out of industrial work. The propaganda that had urged them to build bombers now urged them to build families. Rosie the Riveter became Rosie the Homemaker, with bureaucratic efficiency. Women's wages, never equal, evaporated entirely for many. The Women's Land Army was simply disbanded. No pensions, no recognition, just a thank you note and a civilian clothing allowance. Margaret Pike The former land girl wrote bitterly in August 1945, "Spent 3 years keeping Britain fed. Learned to birth calves, repair tractors, harvest in rain and snow. Now I'm told to return to the library and be grateful for my old job back at reduced hours. The farm where I worked hired a man at twice my wage. He's 17 and doesn't know wheat from barley, but he's male, so he gets the position. We were essential until we weren't." The rationing continued. In Britain, it would last until 1954. Sugar, meat, butter, all still controlled by coupons and queues. The National Loaf remained the only bread available. The victory everyone had sacrificed for felt suspiciously like continued deprivation. People had endured because they believed peace would bring abundance. Instead, it brought austerity and rebuilding. The war had ended. Its consequences were just beginning. The demographic toll was staggering. Across Europe, 60 million dead, soldiers and civilians bombed and starved, murdered and displaced, entire villages erased, cities reduced to rubble fields where survivors salvaged bricks and beams, creating neighborhoods of patchwork reconstruction, charred ruins beside standing facades, houses with one wall missing exposing floral wallpaper and family photographs to the elements. In Britain alone, 450,000 dead, including 60,000 civilians killed in bombing raids. Every town had its war memorial, with fresh names carved below the old ones from the Great War. Families with 2 generations of loss, streets with multiple houses flying Gold Star banners. The children who had been evacuated returned to find homes that felt foreign, parents who had aged a decade, siblings they barely knew. Some children had been gone 6 years, had left as small children, and returned as teenagers with different accents, different habits, different memories. Family albums showed strangers wearing their faces. Mary Henshaw, evacuated from Liverpool Street Station in September 1939, returned in July 1945 at age 13. Her mother Dorothy wrote, "She speaks like a country girl, calls me mum instead of mummy, knows how to milk cows and collect eggs, but doesn't remember our street, our neighbors, the shops we used to visit. She asked where her old bedroom was. I showed her. She stood in the doorway, wouldn't enter, said it felt too small. I realized she's spent 6 years sleeping in a farmhouse attic twice this size. Her childhood bedroom is a museum of a girl who no longer exists." But amid the loss and displacement, small acts of reconstruction began. Families planted gardens in bomb craters, literal victory gardens growing in destruction. Women carefully counted their clothing coupons and bought fabric for new dresses. Not practical utility garments, but something with color, with pattern, with frivolity. Men gathered in pubs and didn't talk about the war, talked instead about football scores and weather and plans for Sunday dinner. The rituals of ordinary life resumed, but they carried new weight. The weekly trimming of coal rations, the counting of soap coupons, the careful airing of clothes in windy yards. These mundane tasks had become something more during the war. They had been small rebellions against chaos, tiny assertions that normal life would continue. Now they were bridges between the world that had been destroyed and the world being rebuilt. Churches filled on Sundays, some with thanksgiving, some with grief, most with both. Congregations that had worshipped in shelters and cellars lit by kerosene lamps now sat in damaged sanctuaries with temporary roofs and boarded windows, singing hymns that had carried them through darkness. Weddings increased dramatically in 1946. Couples who had postponed marriage during the war, servicemen finally home, women finally free to plan futures. But these ceremonies happened in a world of scarcity. Wedding dresses were made from parachute silk or remodeled from mothers' gowns. Cakes were constructed from cardboard tiers with a single real layer on top, the only one the ration would allow. Receptions served sandwiches made from Spam and powdered egg, washed down with weak tea. Yet the joy was genuine. Survival itself was worth celebrating. In private diaries, those intimate records that would be discovered decades later in attics and archives, people recorded their small specific vows: to fix the broken window pane, to plant a pear tree in the garden, to remember the neighbors lost. These concrete personal commitments gave texture to the anonymous mass of the home front, revealing the human scale of endurance. Mrs. Agnes Morrison, the Birmingham housewife who had remade her husband's suit into her son's jacket, wrote on Victory Day, "George came home yesterday, thinner, quieter, older, but home. Tonight I'm going to use next week's butter ration to make a proper cake. It won't be much, 2 eggs worth of powder, a scraping of sugar, but it will be sweet. Tomorrow I'll worry about next week's shortage. Tonight we're going to eat cake and pretend we're the people we were before this all started, even though we know we're not, even though we never will be again." The war had transformed not just nations but the individuals within them. Women who had operated cranes and wielded bombers couldn't unknow their competence. Men who had seen industrialized slaughter couldn't unsee it. Children who had grown up with rationing, blackouts, and separation as normal couldn't simply revert to innocence. The home front hadn't been a place of waiting. It had been a battleground where the weapons were scarcity, fear, and endurance, where victories were measured in preserved jam, repaired shoes, and children kept alive. The people who fought there in kitchens, gardens, factories, and shelters won no medals. History barely recorded their names, but they held the line. They kept the lights off so bombers couldn't navigate. They grew the food that kept Britain fighting. They built the weapons that won the war. They maintained enough normalcy that life could continue, that children could laugh, that hope survived in the dark. The war at home didn't end with a treaty or a surrender. It faded gradually, one lit window at a time, one unrationed item at a time, one absent family member at a time, remaining forever absent. The scars it left were quieter than battlefield wounds, but no less permanent. When they asked later, those who hadn't lived it, what it was like, the survivors struggled to explain. How do you describe the weight of years measured in ounces, the exhaustion of endless small deprivations, the strange duality of terror and tedium? Perhaps Eleanor Wright said it best in her final diary entry from 1945. We survived. That's the only story that matters. Not heroically, not gloriously, but methodically. Day by day, ration by ration, night by night. We mended what could be mended. We endured what couldn't. We're alive. That will have to be enough.